My name's Wendy Buckley and I'm Chair of the Sustainable Business Network here in North Hampshire. This session is focused on renewable energies on site. Here we're focusing on battery technology and also case studies of what it's like to live with solar and other renewables on site.
I'm going to start with our usual legal and market update, and then delighted to have back Martin Heath from the Basingstoke Energy Services Cooperative. And Martin's going to take us through what is the continuation really from the session we did recently that we called Renewable Energy on Site Part 1. You'll remember that we focused quite a lot on solar, very topical, and the business case for doing that. A lot of you asked us for the extension of that, which is obviously into battery technology and how we use that. So Martin's going to do a little bit of a recap on solar and focus more on the storage of energy with batteries. Following on from that, I'm delighted to have Alan Poole from Berry Brothers and Rudd. Alan has been using renewables for a good number of years now across some of his sites. So he's in a really good position to take us through what it's really like to live with those renewables, having had some for a good while and also invested in some new ones recently. Legislation and market trends. Let's have a look at what's been happening since we last got together. There's a little summary on screen here, pictorially, of things that are going on. And oh my goodness, hasn't it all gone off this morning? For those of you that were listening into Radio 4's Today programme whilst you were driving in, hopefully in your electric cars as I was this morning to work, UK Water, Water UK is sorry. Yeah, Water UK is very sorry for all the pollution that it's doing, releasing sewage into our rivers and into our seas. Well, that's great, isn't it? Okay, so the plan here, and this seems to be sort of breaking news, is to upgrade what is a Victorian system with £10 billion of investment, initially loaned for the government, but eventually paid by the customers. So a lot of people not very happy about this, especially when dividends are totaling something like £1 to £2 billion each year. So go do the economics on that, please yourselves. So I suspect that Trey's Coffee is not very happy with any of that at the moment. We'll talk about some of the latest water finds as well in this session. Some good news, Universal Hydrogen, that's an American startup, has flown what is the biggest fully hydrogen-fueled plane yet. This is a 47-seater plane called Lightning McLean, like what they did there. So they've done the first test flight of that. So that's the 47-seater. Since then, the UK-based Zero Avia over at Cranfield have announced a 75-seat hydrogen fuel plane. So it's great to have this competition going on for the biggest hydrogen fuel plane. So for all those worried about Scope 3 emissions and flights, it's really worth watching this. So please do hop onto Freedom Flight Prize's webpage and have a look at the latest on videos and updates with that. Breaking news from yesterday, we're very worried about our ability to stay below 1.5 Celsius, excuse me, and latest modelling showing that that's going to be exceeded by 2027, which isn't great news. Perhaps a little bit better news, and here showing maybe topically here solar panels, is Ukraine beginning to do some of their rebuilding and their commitment to rebuild using sustainable technologies, which is great to see and very heartening. Particular highlight, I think, for this particular area was the Sustainable Skies Summit that took place last month, and I had the pleasure to go along with my colleague Joel and have a look at what was happening there. What a great showcase for UK PLC. Lots going on there, even lots of local innovators. This actually happened at Farnborough International, and here I'm really showcasing the Rolls-Royce EasyJet development of a hydrogen engine there. This was aimed obviously at the medium size and medium range market eventually, but what a great thing to be coming out of UK PLC, just to make that point. Let's move on now to what's happening that will affect us all. Climate disclosure reporting. I know so many of you are used to the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting, SECR. This is what's joining it now. And without getting into too many acronyms, this is TCFD by another name, that being Task Force for Climate Disclosure. Yeah, Task Force, yeah, TCFD. Getting all the acronyms in, it's a little bit tricky. This has been live for reporting years starting after April 2022. So you're probably now in your first year of doing that. And the thing I wanted to really say here is I consider this to be the 500-500 rule. What this means is if your business is on the FTSE main market or on the AIM market and you have more than 500 employees, then you'll need to take part in this. And really, it's looking at risk assessments around climate change and what you're going to do about that. So it's an adjunct really to SECR. The other angle on this is if you're not on the main market or on AIM, but you also have more than 5 million turnover and 500 employees, again, you're going to need to report into this. This is all going to sit within your annual report and accounts. So you can imagine this looking like an extended section with the SECR. We've got links at the end of this, and the slide pack will be available for you to follow through with these because it's a whole topic in itself. Just extending that some more to some more legislations coming through. SECR over on the right, it was the first really in the UK. There's a number of different legislations that we're thinking are coming through over the summer, and it's far too much detail here to go through what those are, but I will pull out a couple of things here. CSRD really is the European version of that. And I'm also going to pull from this the SEC, which is for the United States. We are actually going to be doing a Sustainable Business Network session on this, and we're just holding back until these go on the stature books, really, so we can give you the correct information about this. But I think the point is made there about your readiness to be reporting more broadly, not just SECR, if you do have international dimensions for your business. We'll briefly touch on packaging. I'm not going to claim to be the #1 expert on this, but I'll do the best I can with this. This is about the extended producer responsibility for packaging. This is better known as producer pays, and really saying here that this is in place, and really the thresholds for this are quite low. So this refers to businesses obviously who are producing the waste with annual turnovers of £1 million, which isn't a great amount to be honest, but with more than 25 tonnes of packaging. So if you're an office admin based organisation, this is probably not going to affect you at all. Now there are different main means of reporting and taxation with that we don't have time to go into great detail here, but there are links in the at the end of here for you to follow on, so just be aware of that. Moving down then specifically into plastic packaging, I know the UNEP would like to see 80% of plastics reduced by 2040. So here we are looking at the UK's implementation really on that. And there are some new disclosures there on the levels of taxation. Again, here you can see who this applies to, the various producers, importers, etc. of the packaging who are exceeding 10 tonnes within a given year. Also on there, you can see the cost of doing that. It's £200 per tonne currently. We move on. Right, it's always good to have a bit of Brexit in here, so let's do that. And this is about retained EU laws. You probably remember that the EU laws were basically kept in and were supposed to be in until the end of the year. That was the plan. The government's basically ditched that and now has a list of 600 pieces of environmental legislation that it says and is confident it's going to get through before the end of the year. There is a schedule of what those things are. There's a list there for you to have a look at. And beyond those 600, then everything is going to be out. So please do peruse that list to those areas that are obviously of interest and relevance to your business. We'll move on then to net zero, and I know a good number of you tuned in to listen to Dr. Duncan East, my colleague's session on net zero. And this is really about what they're calling beyond value chain mitigation, which seems to be a very grand term for what is basically what you and I typically call offsetting. I think SBTI was perhaps a bit worried that they were seen as being anti-offsetting, and in fact, it's quite the opposite. Whereas it's true that to achieve net zero, you aren't able to use carbon offsets that are reduction based. And by that, I mean they could be solar power, they could be wind power, things that reduce the emissions on the grid. You are allowed to use ones that are removals. The problem at the moment is there just isn't enough removals available. And also, as science-based targets is at pains to point out, without having the reductions from solar, wind power, etc., we don't get the emissions down on global and societal grids. It doesn't happen, so the models fall over. So science-based targets have started using the term beyond value chain mitigation with some very telling headlines saying it is urgent that we invest in beyond value chain mitigation. Whilst we go towards net zero, we should be mitigating all our emissions via these projects. So that's something that perhaps you haven't seen, and I think this is important here because I think beyond value chain mitigation otherwise is a little bit of a clunky term, but basically this is offsetting. We move on to fines, water companies' fines, and well, we've all seen the news and seen what's online today. There's just two examples pulled out at the moment. We've got Anglian Water with a record level of fine. Well, I think none of this is a surprise. Untreated sewage going into the North Sea. We've heard it all this morning. Southwest Water, again, with an astonishing was it £2.1 million fine for their transgressions in Devon and Cornwall, which is very reliant, obviously, on their waterways. So it seems that there's no limit to the amount that they seem to be paying and continuing with those behaviours. So I think Therese Coffey and the team are looking for ways to make sure that those fines can be bigger and bigger. I just wonder what would happen if there were custodial sentences as well associated with these crimes, if that would change the way that companies are behaving. Finally, I'm not going to go through this. There is a whole raft of links here for you to follow up as a bit of homework, so please do that. And the slide packs will be available online for you to just grab those from. And now we'll move over and look at the survey results. I've just got that still on screen there, the QR code, and I think I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Joel, who's going to pull up the results and see how we're doing.
Well, the first question asks, do you already use renewable energy on site? So this is talking about with a renewable energy tariff, or maybe you've got solar panels or some other form of energy production, which so far everyone who has said that they do have they do use renewables on site is talking about a renewable energy tariff, which is absolutely fine. Those are brilliant, and the results are coming in as we speak, which is good to see. And it looks like, yep, the main reasons that we are not on renewable energy tariffs are other reasons, which is interesting to see too. Normally when I work with companies as an environmental consultant, we normally see that companies can't get onto renewable tariffs because they are owned by landlords, but only one of you has put that so far. So I'd be interested to see what the other ones are. So getting quotes for solar panels is in progress. Yeah, so it could just be that there's a bit of a waiting list for solar panels, which I guess in today's age would be expected, because obviously the price of energy has gone up significantly, so the demand for solar panels is going to be increased as well. Oh, one of you's got solar panels. That's good to see. Yeah, and it's also very good to see that a vast majority of you are using renewable energy.
Great. Okay. Now I'm delighted to welcome back Martin Heath from the Basingstoke Energy Service Co-op. Over to you, Martin.
Good morning. Hope everyone is well and can hear me.
Yep, we can hear you.
Excellent. Okay, let me just share my screen and we can move on. There's some interesting responses to the survey there. Yeah, I mean, we often, as people might be aware, Basingstoke Energy Services Co-op installs solar PV for commercial organisations. Yeah, and we find that getting landlord permission is often one of the barriers, not an insurmountable one, by the way, but we can perhaps talk about that later on. Anyway, I just wanted to show, really, as Wendy was saying, build on from the previous session, which I think was back in February. Building on that discussion we had last time back in February, where we talked about a lot about solar PV. The conclusion, I think, was pretty clear that solar PV for almost everyone is a excellent investment, and we should all be looking at it, subject to some of those barriers we came across. But just a very brief resume of what we discussed in the last session. Yeah, it's all about getting the right roof. Most of us have that right roof in terms of orientation and pitch, the age of the roof and the material that the roof is made of. Matching PV generation with consumption is very important to make sure you maximise the yield in terms of the financial yield, but clearly batteries can help with that, and we'll go on to talk about batteries in the next couple of slides. Make sure the internal distribution system in electrical system is good enough. It often is, but sometimes we find that reinforcement is required. Making sure that solar PV is optimised against the consumption patterns is very important. And then look at the hard business case in terms of money. You know, what's the financial return from solar PV? But also there are softer benefits, some that are not so easy to quantify, but emissions reductions, benefits to employees, particularly in attracting new employees. It's a very powerful statement to customers and employees and other stakeholders that you are very keen on becoming a low carbon organisation. It's a very visible statement stuck on the roof. As we said at that last meeting, the potential benefits are huge. Now, for anyone who wasn't on the last meeting or wanted to have a recap of that, I think that's the link to it is there. I'm sure Wendy and Joel can share that later on, but that's the link to the previous session. Anyway, let's talk about batteries. So let's assume you've already got PV or you're getting to PV. The next question is, should I invest in batteries as well? And I want to really cover three areas today. What types of battery are there out in the marketplace? How should they be used? And then a very brief case study showing the trade-offs that have to be made to make batteries work. But I think if we wanted to end the discussion now, there's probably a couple of things to take away from this meeting this morning. Batteries are far more complex than PV alone. It's a more complex way of understanding exactly what benefit they bring. There's lots of different types of technology out there, and I'll go across the main ones. It's all about, as with solar PV, balancing the load on your site, the generation, you've got the load patterns, I should say, the generation that's going to be coming from solar PV, and the consumption patterns over 24 hours and over the year of a particular site. It's absolutely vital to monitor and control batteries. They can't just plug them in and hope for the best. They do need a lot of control, but that's fine. There's plenty of control mechanisms out there. Most of the major manufacturers have some pretty good systems now. I think to also bear in mind, batteries don't always work financially. Most of the time they do, but not always, and that's something worth bearing in mind if you are going to make an investment decision in them, is to really understand whether they work for you in your particular set of circumstances. The other thing, to understand why you want batteries, and we can go into some of the detail of that in the next couple of slides. And I think the other thing to bear in mind, and this is quite important, there are two modes of use for batteries. It's how you use them in the winter and how you use them in the summer. In the summer, it's all about time shifting solar generation from, say, midday to the evening. In the winter, it's all about charging batteries overnight on cheaper grid electricity, and then using that electricity the following day. And both of those have their own business cases. So today is really about small scale. I'm not going to talk about grid scale batteries. It's a different story altogether. But it's the sorts of things you might have in your factory, in your office, or indeed even your home. So that's the sort of level I want to talk about today. Happy to talk about some of the bigger grid scale stuff a little bit later on. Who are we? Basingstoke Energy Services Co-op. Well, we've been in the renewables industry since about 2012. Indeed, I mean, I think I wrote my first research paper on renewables in 1980. So I've been doing sort of renewables for some time. These are the sorts of organisations we work for. A lot of work is in community energy, but a huge amount is with commercial organisations, schools, community groups, councils, local authorities, public services. We've got London Fire Brigade there, for instance. We've put lots of solar PV on the roofs of fire stations across London, as well as many other places. Basingstoke College of Technology is another one where they have 100 kilowatts on there. So that's what we do. These are the sorts of things you might see around, and these are pictures of installations in and around Basingstoke, or thereabouts. And that's what we mainly do, is design solar PV systems, install solar PV systems, and also maintain them now. We also work quite a lot with customers and clients doing business cases for other renewables, heat pumps, wind turbines, etc. So that's what we've been up to. So first question, why would I need a battery? Well, these are the sorts of questions I ask myself. Well, it's relatively straightforward. It's to store surplus generated electricity. So you've got solar PV, it's generating surplus electricity, which is going back to the grid. You want to capture that and use it later. Is to capture cheap overnight electricity, because clearly, as we're beginning to see in the electricity market, very often electricity overnight is cheaper than electricity during the peak hours. No surprises there, but you can go through what is effectively an arbitrage process, buying it cheap and using it when it's expensive. Clearly, it provides backup. Not as much backup as you sometimes tend to think. It needs to be carefully thought through, how does it provide backup and to what circuits when there is an outage or power outage. There's another host of other services that batteries can be used for. These are providing services back to the grid. These are things like providing grid stability services, short-term operating reserve, which is just actually making sure the grid remains stable. Fast frequency response is helping the grid maintain its frequency, but those are quite complex. Not what I want to talk about today, because that's a different whole series of discussions about how grid scale batteries work, but happy to do that if anyone's interested. But today is much more about the smaller scale systems. On the left there, you can see that's actually a system we installed very recently. That's 6 or 7 batteries. There's about a 5 kilowatt inverter there. Which can charge the batteries at 5 kilowatts and discharge the batteries at 5 kilowatts and can store about 14 kilowatt hours of energy. The grid scale stuff on the right there is the stuff we won't be talking about today. They can range up to megawatts in terms of power and megawatt hours in terms of storage energy. But we are at the, if you like, the lower end today. There's types of batteries. Things probably to bear in mind is whether it's connected directly to the AC side of a system or the DC coupled side of the system, or whether it's a hybrid. I'll try and explain those terms. DC connected just means that the flow of electricity from the solar PV goes straight to the batteries. DC to DC tends to be a little bit more efficient. Because you don't have some of the conversion losses, but tend also then to occasionally be a little bit more expensive. AC connected systems, no surprises, sit behind or in front of the inverter. So the DC comes from the solar PV, goes to the inverter, converted into AC current, and then goes into the battery if there's spare, or it goes into the providing power to the load within the site. So those are the two sides of things there. Increasingly now, I say increasingly, almost 100% of the time, we're using hybrid inverters, which are a combination of battery chargers and solar PV inverters all in one. It's a much more cheaper and much more efficient way of putting batteries into a new system. If you've got an existing system, it tends to be having to put in an AC connected solar PV. The other area that's probably very useful to know about, a little bit about the chemistry of batteries, and that can range from something that's known as saltwater flow batteries, which are massive, thousands of tons of salt water flowing through a battery, which is not what we're really thinking about. Lead acid, more traditional, everyone's got one of those in their car. Lithium ion and lithium ion phosphate are the ones that are most common these days, and all of those different technologies vary in terms of the energy density, by how many kilowatt hours per kilogram of battery can you get, how long they can store batteries, energy, how quickly they can charge and discharge, and of course how much they cost. But lithium iron phosphate is perhaps currently the favoured chemistry. It is the cheapest, and that's probably the one that we're most common to see in and around the installations that we're doing at the moment. So that's the types. Just give you a feel for the physical size and what do they look like. Starting with the left, something that's relatively small. That's a bespoke system, but built from individual battery components. And that's actually in a farm not far from here. And in the middle, there's something called this is particularly a stack of batteries. With that one's installed in a community centre, again not far from here. Around about 10, 11 kilowatt hours and 4 kilowatts power capability. The Tesla Powerball, which is very popular and actually a very good piece of kit, which is about 13.5 kilowatt hours and can discharge and charge at 5 kilowatt hours. So those are the sorts of things you might small office, small factory, small home, or actually quite a large home. And of course they are eminently scalable, compared with the Tesla Powerwall, which is about 1.1 meters tall. You can get units that are far more powerful than that. There's one example there, the K-Star, which is far more used in much bigger commercial and industrial situations, where you're talking about storing 100 kilowatt hours and charge and discharge at 50 kilowatts or more. And indeed, the thing about batteries are they're eminently scalable. We put in for one domestic customer, four Tesla Powerwalls in one home. Very unique home, but that's can generate clearly around about 50 kilowatt hours of battery. You can stack 20 of those K-Star batteries together to give you megawatts and megawatt hours of battery storage and power if so required. So that just gives you a feel physically of what they look like and where they might go. Many of them are what is known as IP65 rated, so they can go outside, not necessarily have to be inside a building. So that's the battery technologies and the types of batteries. Let's talk a little about why we should use them. So this is a slide I actually used in the last session. The blue line is the load within the building in kilowatts every half an hour. The red line may be what a very large solar PV system might generate during the summer. The yellow line is a smaller system. The green line, again, is something in an interim system between the two. The problem with a very large system, as you can see, is that any excess generation above what is being consumed gets sold back to the grid, which is fine, but you might only get 10p a kilowatt hour for that sort of excess capacity. And of course, then you don't have any generation during the evening. So it's about getting, what do you do with that excess electricity? And as the graph at the bottom shows, the idea is to store that surplus energy that would have otherwise gone back to the grid and use it the following evening. So that's about capturing generation as and when it is, and really the time shifting there is about 5 to 6 hours from midday into the evening. Getting battery sizing is right, correct is not right. It's getting it right is absolutely critical. Here's an example actually from a real system. This is the monitoring software that most systems now come with, and hopefully you can see you can see my cursor. But what we have is the solar PV generating, and this particular time peaking at 6 kilowatts. But the issue here with this particular system, that by 11 o'clock in the morning, a 4 kilowatt hour battery is completely full. So from 11 o'clock right the way through to the evening, that battery would potentially either be being used to provide the electricity to the site, or more likely, as in this case, it's all being exported back to the grid, which is effectively losing money. That electricity, which is worth 33p or whatever your electricity tariff is to you, is being sold back to the grid at less than a third of the price. So interesting, in this particular case, this particular user has a heat pump, which goes to show that which is used to heat a swimming pool. So you don't have to store things in batteries. There are other stores of energy. In this case, a heat pump that's used for heating a swimming pool, and for, in this particular case, an electric vehicle. But it's getting that monitoring right and making sure the battery knows how to prioritize which particular loads it needs to meet at any particular time. So any excess solar PV needs to go into the battery, and then once it's into the battery, then what else can that spare electricity be used for? So monitoring and metering are pretty critical aspects of any battery system, and it's worthwhile investing a little bit of time in looking at what sort of monitoring and control systems a particular battery has. And indeed, some are better than others. This is the second mode I was talking about. This is overnight charging, sometimes called arbitrage. Thanks to an organisation called Energy Stats UK. If you ever want to have any statistics on energy use in the UK, I recommend you have a look at their website. But this is looking at, for instance, the tariff that Octopus were offering last Sunday. So you can see what you might want to do in this particular case. These are the pence per unit, or the pence per kilowatt hour by every half an hour through the day. Clearly, the opportunity here is to charge the battery overnight during the cheap period and use it in the following evening. Now, in the summer, it's not possible to do that because your battery needs to be empty, so it can be charged up from excess solar PV in the summer. But clearly in the winter, it's a very different mode of use. The battery won't be charged up during the day from solar PV. So the trick there is to charge it up as soon as you can overnight. A couple of points to note there is how quickly can you charge a battery overnight. You can't obviously fill a 13 or 20 kilowatt hour battery in a half an hour, not unless you have massive amounts of power going into it. So you need to understand that the inverter size will determine how quickly charge can be put into the battery. If you've got a 5 kilowatt battery and you have a 4-hour charging period, where effectively you can get 20 kilowatt hours of energy into that battery over a 4-hour period, but that's all, no more. If you want more storage, you need bigger batteries. So the trick really is to try and fill a battery overnight in about 4 hours during that low tariff period. And of course, the battery size and the inverter size determines how quickly you can discharge. Now, if you are looking for grid backup, for instance, or if you've got a 5 kilowatt inverter, it can only possibly deliver 5 or 6 kilowatts maximum power to the site. If you've got a smaller inverter, maybe 3 kilowatts. That's the maximum power it can deliver to a home. So for instance, if you were using it as power backup in your home during a power cut, don't turn on the kettle, because your battery won't be able to meet the demand. So it's worth bearing in mind when you're looking at backup, which circuits to back up and when. Clearly, having a whole site backup is incredibly expensive and not always necessary. So those are the sorts of issues to consider. So broadly, that's the two modes of use. Summer, use it to store its excess solar PV. Winter, use it to take advantage of the price differentials across the time of day. What makes a good investment in batteries? Well, these are the factors that need to be considered. The installation costs, clearly, and the way to look at that is the cost per kilowatt hour, i.e. how much does it cost for the storage, and the cost per kilowatt, i.e. how much does it cost for the inverters to actually take the electricity from the batteries, or to put the electricity into the batteries in the first place. It's absolutely vital to understand how much of your current solar PV is available. If there is no available excess PV, it's very little point in putting in batteries, because there's nothing and no excess to store. And how you use your electricity. If you're using all your electricity during the day when the solar PV there anyway, it will make a big difference to the financial returns, as opposed to using the electricity overnight. So the pattern of load is very important. Understanding how much you actually need. It's very easy to oversize or undersize a battery, as we'll look at in the case study that follows. How much capacity do you need in terms of kilowatt hours, and how quickly do you want to charge that capacity or discharge that capacity in kilowatts? Clearly, that you also really need to understand what price you can buy electricity at and what price you can sell it back to the grid at, which is another opportunity. Depth of discharge, people will mention. Don't believe all of the marketing hype that comes out of battery manufacturers when they say they are providing you with a 10 kilowatt hour battery. That's not necessarily the case. Only 80 or 90% of that capacity might actually be usable. So a 10 kilowatt hour battery may only provide 9 kilowatt hours of usable storage. The only place that is different actually is in the Tesla Powerwalls, where what they say on the tin is actually what you get, a 13.5 kilowatt hour. Tesla Powerwall actually does have 13.5 kilowatt hours of usable capacity in it. So the other point there really is, bear in mind, particularly for domestic provider, this doesn't apply so much to commercial organisations, that if batteries are installed at the same time as solar PV, they are VAT free or zero VAT. So it's often worth thinking about putting in batteries at the same time as solar PV if you possibly can. And clearly you can meet the other factors we're talking about there. So there's a lot of information there, and it's incredibly complex. And what I thought I'd try and do is just try to illustrate through the use of a case study of how to size a battery and what impact having too much or too little battery size or too much or too little solar PV can have. So let's look at a case study. This could be a small or medium-sized enterprise or a large home. It's got 10 kilowatt solar PV on the roof, not quite south-facing, but not far off the south, on a 35-degree pitch in this particular case. In this case, the plan is to install about 11.6 kilowatt hour battery, 10.4 of which is actually usable, and with a 7.5 kilowatt hybrid inverter. This particular unit uses 6,000 kilowatt hours a year. In terms of electricity consumption brought from the grid, the solar PV can generate 9,000 kilowatt hours per year. Cost of install roughly 16,500. Now, what I'm going to do now is to try to use a bit of technology which may or may not work. What I want to do is share an online tool that we use, which can actually show how a battery and solar PV interacts in real time. Now, my apologies if this doesn't work. We tried it in the rehearsal this morning, it worked fine, but sometimes things don't work quite as you want them to. But anyway, let's see what we can do. Oops, I think I might have lost you. Let's try again.
Martin, we're just looking at you at the moment.
Oh, right, well, my
which is very lovely to look at.
Pretty subsided early in the morning. Yeah, I'm just trying to get the this site back.
Yes, we've got it. We see it.
Okay, well, look, that's one there. Let me try and see if I can find the other one. Yeah, that one there. All right, so this is that case study I was we were talking about. So basically, this is a 10 kilowatt on a roof with a 6,000 kilowatt hours annual consumption. This is a simulation model. It's not obviously in this particular case not real data, but this is a simulation of how much solar would be generated, how much energy would be consumed, and how much energy would come to and from the grid. So in this particular case, you can see over the year, the blue is how much of the solar PV I'm actually using on site. The green shows how much of the excess solar PV is being put into the battery for use later on, and the red shows how much is going back to the grid. So this is with a 10 kilowatt solar PV and a rather large 11.6 kilowatt hour battery. Now, That's okay, it's fine. I mean, it says here some of it's coming to the battery, about 2,000 kilowatt hours a year is being captured and reused, which is great, but there's still a significant amount going back to the grid, which is clearly not quite what you want to achieve, because the idea is to minimize the amount that goes back to the grid. And we can look at any particular day. This is the 5th of June. So you can see that what happens here in the green is that early in the morning, the battery field is being charged from the solar PV. By about 9:30 in the morning, the battery's full, because the solar PV is producing so much electricity. And for the rest of the day, the red, most of the solar PV that's being generated is actually going back to the grid, which is fine. I mean, the fact you get 10p a kilowatt hour for it, but it means it's effectively not giving you the full value of that electricity. We can pick another day, perhaps in the winter, where it's slightly different, and now we can see that the solar PV generation is hardly anything at all, a couple of kilowatts. Most of it's being used on site, and very little is going to the battery, purely because there's just not enough generation. If we look at the battery utilization on that particular day, overall in this particular case, the battery's only being used 55% of the time. On the 21st of February, it's actually only being used 15% of the time. Sits there, charges up a little bit during the day, and then discharges back down to 10%, which is what its minimum depth of discharge is for this particular battery. So in this particular case, you might conclude that we've got a mismatch between how much solar PV is on the roof, how much consumption there is within that particular site, and how big the battery is. So it may well be worth trying to look at something that's slightly different. I'll now swap over to another website, or the same website but a different part of it.
Please, if you could. About 5 minutes, please, Martin, if you could.
Yeah, and then I should be fine then. Let's go to the other one. So now this is precisely the same house or office. Now, instead of having 10 kilowatts on the roof, it's only got 6 kilowatts on the roof. So, and the battery is the same size, but you can see the difference now. And that far less electricity is being spilled to the grid, and far more of what is being generated is actually being captured either by the battery or used on site. And in this particular case, the financial case for a smaller battery is actually far more sensible. So it's just an illustration, really, that getting that battery size can be quite important. So that's just really hopefully try to bring together the various component parts and give you a little bit of an insight into how it might all work. So let me just go back to the slideshow. And just to summarize there, again, exactly the same graphs and exactly the same sort of model. That's what happens if we have too big a battery. Too much of it is going back to the grid, and 51% in this particular case. And this is what it looks like across the year. Again, 6,000 kilowatt hours for consumption, but only 36% of that coming from the solar, and 31% of it coming going back to the grid. With a smaller system, clearly generation is lower, but far more of the electricity is being generated, either being captured by the battery or being used on site. And of course, because it's a now more optimized system, it's much cheaper, and the rate of return is much better. Which again shows this over the year. It's now a far better balanced system, with the solar PV matched, the size of the solar PV matched to the size of the battery, which is also matched to the size of the consumption on a particular site. So to conclude, I've gone through a lot there, and that's hopefully it's not too quick, but that's it. Batteries are a very complex area. Solar PV is far easier to comprehend and understand. Batteries are a step above that, as we hopefully might have demonstrated in the case study. So basically things, if you're going into the battery world, think about what types of battery to use, think about how you should use them, bear in mind the results of that case study. Getting that balance between the size of the battery, the size of the load, and the size of the PV is absolutely important. That means monitoring and control are vital. to make sure that the loads are being met as you need them. So the solar PV, the excess solar PV is being directed to the right place. So if there's load within the site that could use that electricity, it should go there first. If not, then it should go either to an EV charger or to the batteries. And broadly, batteries work, but not always. So it's not the sort of a slam dunk investment that solar PV often is. So really ask yourself those sorts of questions. Is this what I really want to do? Why do I want to do it? And also remember there are two modes of use. How you use a battery in the winter is often very different to how you use a battery in the summer. Having said that, it's all very possible. Lots of people are putting in some batteries. They are, in the right circumstances, an excellent investment and can do a lot in terms of financial return. The environmental return is also very good. And it's something that we should all consider, but consider with due care. So I think that's all I wanted to cover. And really, it's just any questions or moving on to the next presenter. Thank you very much.
Martin, thank you so much for that. Absolutely fascinating and really eye-opening with those models there. Thank you so much for that. I think we've got time just for one question, and Joel's just monitoring the questions coming in. So we'll just take one in the interest of time there, please, Joel.
So Rex Kellett asked a question which says, you mentioned power cuts. Do inverters isolate the grid during power cuts to allow the use of PV power in the building without energizing the grid that a power worker might think is unenergized? I think what they're needing is a transfer switch, but yeah, go for it.
I think there's a safety element to that, isn't there?
Yeah. There is a lot of regulation, as you would expect and hope, around both solar PV and batteries for exactly that reason. It's protecting people working on the grid, or indeed, actually, for that matter, working on site. If you have backup, there is a requirement to make sure that the system is isolated from the grid. Certainly all the battery systems we use is that isolation happens automatically. It's effectively a contactor which will break the contact between the grid and the battery and solar PV system. Not all solar PV systems and battery combinations can work such that the solar PV continues to charge the battery during a power cut. It is technology specific. The ones we use, I think certainly the Powerwall is pretty good. The Tesla Powerwall is quite good at doing that. But then other ones on the market are not so good. Indeed, in some of them, it requires quite a substantial amount of rewiring to make sure you can back up the right circuits. Because clearly, if you want to back up the whole house and your inverter is not big enough, you have to choose which circuits you want backing up. Maybe obviously computers, etc. But you won't be able to power the whole site. So it's very technology specific, but yes, absolutely. Safety is an enormously important factor in all of this, and there's a huge amount of regulation about how and when batteries and solar PV need to disconnect from the grid, and how quickly they have to disconnect from the grid.
Oh my goodness, we could do a whole nother session on that, couldn't we, Martin?
You probably could.
There we are.
If anyone was interested. But again, some of the detail it is very detailed, but it's incredibly important.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, thank you so much, Martin, for that fascinating session. In the interest of time, we're going to move on now to Alan Paul from Berry Brothers and Rudd. Alan, over to you, please.
Right. Good morning, everybody. Can they hear me and see me now?
You're all good to go, Alan.
Excellent. Good morning. I'm site facilities manager for Berry Brothers and Rudd. Have worked for the company for nearly 40 years, and I was responsible for having our solar panels installed. We've had them installed in our Basingstoke building since 2015. We've got best part of 1,000 panels, 250 kilowatts, and over a period of a year that will generate approximately 1/3 of our energy usage. We've also got a brand new site in Andover, brand new, it's a year old now, and we've put some solar onto that as well. Living with solar panels has been very, very easy. They've been really, really easy to maintain. We've lost 2 panels over the period of time they've been there so far, both of those to bird damage, and it appears crows believe that it's water and drop stones on it. And we've had 2 panels broken in that way. They've survived all the storms, not had any issues with those. And as you can see, that's an aerial view. So we've got about 2/3 of our flat roof covered in the panels, and it does say how much there that we've generated since 2015. And the system itself was installed so that there was no capital outlay to the company, and for the first 5 years the feed-in tariff which existed then and the reduction in the bill paid for the panels. I think if it had been a cost, it was about £230,000. Is that right? Yeah, sorry, £320,000. Got my figures mixed up. And as you can see from the note there, we use all of it on site to help maintain our temperature controlled wine facilities. Just a little graph shows we take readings from all the meters just to show how much we've used annually, which is just so that we know what we're using. And you can see the vagaries of the English weather do put all that together. So just really as little sort of system notes, it was 2015 installation, which has gone very, very well. They're very low maintenance. We have them cleaned every 2 years. We have the inverters serviced every year, and our building is now 56 years old and has got an A-rated EPC. If we go down to look at the site in Andover, the upper line is what we use from the grid, and the lower line, the solar energy that we generate. It's been very, very interesting, the fact that as we've started filling the site up, it will hold approximately 12 million bottles of wine, and we're about half full now. And that as we've been filling it up, we've noticed that we're using less energy because of that thermal mass of all the bottles in the cases, slowly cooling the inside of the building down. I think the best day we've had, we actually generated 61% of our energy from the solar, but as an average, it comes out somewhere around 40%. And we intend to put more solar onto that building, but the local grid wouldn't be able to stand it, so they've got to do an upgrade locally so that we can put some more solar onto the roof. As you can see, it is quite a big roof. The site is 114,000 square feet warehouse, again all turned over for the storage of wine, and we've only got a relatively small amount of solar on it at the moment. The real plan is to make the whole building sort of carbon neutral and off the grid as an annual turnover. And strangely enough, we've got a solar farm as our next door neighbours, and they obviously generate a huge amount of energy just locally. So as it went in last year, it's still sort of early days with how it all runs, but again, we've not had any issues over 12-month period. We're just coming in where we will be servicing the inverters for the first year. We probably won't clean the panels this year, but we'll do that next year. And the site is considered the largest fine wine storage unit in the UK. And just as an aside, the company celebrates 325 years in business this year. We are, I think, the 7th oldest company in the country, which is also quite an achievement because it's still owned by the 2 families. And although I think that was a little shorter than I probably intended, because I've spoken a little too rather quickly, that's just sort of the living with the solar.
Alan, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I had the pleasure and privilege to actually go and have a look at your solar panels up on the Basingstoke roof. I think shortly after they'd been installed. So it's great to actually hear how those have been faring, and also to know about your what you've done at Andover. We do have time for a question for Alan, if anyone has got one there they want to pop on chat. I did actually have one that was submitted offline from here, from someone who couldn't join the session, which is really saying about the solar panels, Alan. Really, you mentioned obviously the biodiversity had a little bit of go at 2 panels, but that aside, what are you seeing happen in terms of the efficiency and generation of those panels going forward, and where do you expect those to go over, what might be a 20-year lifetime for them?
They're still working sort of basically at their sort of maximum potential. We were told when they were put in that at 25 years they should still be working at around 70% of efficiency. But we're possibly now looking, because at the time they've been there, is maybe starting to upgrade in sections some of the older panels, because new panels are incredibly more efficient than the ones we've got. And the ones in Andover, we've got very few, but they generate actually more electricity and more efficiently than we do in Basingstoke.
Great. Martin, I was going to ask you to comment on this. Martin, I'm sure you can fill in with a bit more on those longevity of the panels and what we can expect to see.
Yeah, it's very much what Alan said. We've been installing these since 2012. So, the old systems are now 11, 12 years old, coming up for 12 years old. And we have actually been pleasantly surprised, as Alan was saying, that all the manufacturers are saying that there'll be quite a strong degradation in performance over the years. We're not finding in the degradation anywhere near as what the manufacturers said they would be. Clearly the issues are often around inverters actually failing, which is probably more common now. And we're beginning to see that first, if you like, replacement cycle where inverters installed 12, 20, 13, 14 years ago are beginning to fail. But again, they're relatively cheap to replace. And yeah, it's interesting that Alan's thinking about this, what we would call repowering some of them. And I know quite a few people are saying, yeah, look, I've had those panels up there for 12, 15 years. More modern panels are sort of 50, 60% more efficient than the ones we put on there 12 years ago. Is it time to take some of them off and put new ones back on? The issue there, you have to be very careful if you've got feed-in tariffs. Because you make changes to the system that has feed-in tariffs, you can actually break some of the conditions of feed-in tariff, and there's a potential of losing that if you make too many additions or alterations to the system. But if you haven't got feed-in tariff, it's not an issue.
Okay.
And having looking at Alan's numbers, definitely doesn't need a battery. What he needs is more solar PV on that roof.
I think we're kind of de facto moving into the panel discussion here, which is right for us to do. I think what we might do, Deanna, I can see you have a question there, and Joel, I know that you wish to speak as well. I think we might see if we can have another look at the poll, because I know that you have been filling that in. So let's perhaps just briefly revisit that again, if we can there, Joel. If you've got that there to share, and see if there's anything there, any bearing on that, because that might give us an idea for some of the questioning that's about. I know I have had some offline ones here as well, but I suspect that a number of you are thinking the same thing. So please do go ahead and put your questions in the chat there. You can talk a little bit outside of just the solar and the batteries if you've got any other comments on renewables. If you want to ask anything about air source or ground source as well, please do pop that in the chat there, because I'm sure that Alan and Martin would love to answer that question there. I think Joel's just sharing the screen there, and we'll have a look at what our survey's now saying.
Okay, so it hasn't been fully filled out by everyone, but we've got a total of 10 responses. And what was interesting to me is that we've got someone who has an air source heat pump, which is really interesting to see.
Fantastic.
Obviously, we can't get loads of information out of just that, but it is good to see that some people have taken up presumably taken up the opportunities that were there from the government regarding installing those, which obviously they've been quite expensive. So a lot of people have sort of not necessarily been able to install them for that reason. I would like to see more of this. I actually have a question for Martin, if I'm if I can ask it. And
Deanna will come to you in a moment. We hear you.
So I was wondering if we've got electric cars that have batteries that are so big. I think the Tesla is like 75 kilowatt hour battery. Would it be possible to use solar energy to charge up that battery, then discharge it back onto your system when you've got peak demand and therefore energy is expensive, and then charge it again overnight when energy is cheap?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Yeah, it's called vehicle to grid or vehicle to home. And yeah, there's a lots of investment being put into exactly this. Can't quite be done yet because some of the technology and some of the regulations haven't been sorted out. But I can imagine the scenario in 10, maybe even 5 years actually, where a huge electric vehicles are actually providing power back to the grid at quite some substantial rates. And so same with batteries. And it's this concept that you might have come across called virtual power stations, where EVs and their batteries and batteries in homes and in offices actually become like a virtual power station where we've got gigawatts of battery storage installed, very decentralized and lots of it, so thousands if not millions of batteries, but they can all be linked together and act as though they're a one big power station. So yeah, vehicle to grid is absolutely possible from a pure, if you like, electrical perspective, but it's the technology, and well, it's not the technology, it's really more around the regulations and how to control all of this. But it absolutely, dangerous to make a prediction, particularly about the future. But yeah, that's what we're going to see, vehicle to grid and a lot of it.
If I can make a comment, sorry, Deanna, we will come to you just on the EV side. My EV, I can't connect anything to it in the house. But there are others that can, or certainly within the marketing blurb on the MG4, which is an incredibly affordable little EV. And actually, it's a cracking little drive if you get the ability to do it. I don't work for MG, by the way. MG are claiming that you can link some household items up to the MG4. So this idea of being the portable battery, the battery on wheels that you can use, as I think Joel's describing there, I can see that. What's the MG4 doing? Do you know, Martin? Is that for real, the claim on being able to connect things up to it?
My colleague in my office is an absolute expert in this, and can answer almost every question you need to know about EVs. So, but yeah, my understanding is 1 or 2 models on there at the moment can effectively give you almost what looks like a 13 amp socket.
Okay.
So just plug it in, and it could run perhaps something or one circuit, but actually feed the grid. Yeah, and I think the Ionic is one of those cars that can do that. And others on this call may be aware of others, but it's just beginning to come in where you can actually draw some power off the EV to power small items in the home, but to actually plug it in and then feed it into the distribution board or the consumer unit and then use it as a backup power is not quite, we're not quite there yet.
Great. Okay, thank you. We really need to move on to the contributed questions now. Joel, do you want to lead those?
So Dana said that she said, do you purchase, this is presumably to Alan, do you purchase additional energy from the grid? I have been told if we install them, we would still need a substantial amount of energy from the grid.
Yeah, yes, we still take 2/3 of our energy from the grid. We sometimes get off grid during the day, but obviously during the night hours, because we use all of the energy ourselves, we are taking it from the grid then.
presumably it depends on the size of your system as well. Like if you have enough roof space, then you may be able to account for your demand. And also it depends on the sun. It's not always shining.
Yeah, that would actually be the plan down in Andover, that we would be able to generate enough. They also do something which Martin probably knows about as well, where you can generate it, and any excess you put in what they call the bank, and then you take that back during low usage. So for ourselves, we put it in the bank during the day and then take it back during the night when there's less demand.
Yeah, there's some fascinating technology coming along which can do exactly that. Well, effectively, where you're using your excess capacity or generation in the day to actually charge up someone else's battery. Do you remember I showed you that picture of those grid scale batteries? So you can actually begin to enter into contracts to sell your spare electricity to those people, and they can store it for you, if you like, offline. And then it's almost like a cloud computing, but it's cloud battery storage.
Yeah.
And then you can buy it back later on at a cheaper rate. There's some fascinating stuff happening in renewables, and these and particularly around batteries and solar PV and wind, and in combination. Interest for the younger people on the call. It's a fascinating industry to be in for the next 10 to 15 years.
Here's another question contributed anonymously here, which is, do it now or do it later? In essence, I've got a new build. Shall I do it now? It's extra cost, or do I wait till later when the price goes down to put my solar panels and plus perhaps some batteries on?
Yeah, the best time to put in solar PV is when you're building a new roof or a new building, for several reasons. Well, it's VAT and free anyway, but some of the cost of solar PV is at roof access costs, scaffolding, etc. etc.
Yeah.
So if you've got the scaffolding up, you might as well put in the solar PV because it's free use of that. And also, there's quite a lot of systems now where you can use the solar panels or solar modules as the roof membrane itself. So it saves you costs on tiling, for instance, if you use the solar PV system as a waterproof membrane. So my answer is, yeah, if it makes sense and you've got the right sort of roof and it's pointing in the right sort of direction, do it now.
Good stuff. Good stuff. So do you think there's any more cost that's going to come out of panels with the cost volume curve? I guess that's the other point of it, is we've seen it come down a lot. Are we nearing the trough, if you like, of the cost there?
Again, always dangerous to
predict markets,
prediction.
right?
But no, I mean, prices. I mean, the issue in the UK is that we're working in an international market, so we're actually exposed to exchange rates more than anything else at the moment. But the general trend in solar PV is downwards in terms of the cost. Two things are happening with solar modules: is the cost is coming down and the efficiency is going up. So yeah, it's a double whammy, which means they are getting cheaper and cheaper. But that's, yeah, it's a bit like, do I buy my PC, my laptop now, or do I wait until laptop prices fall? This was the perennial question 5 or 6 years ago. But fundamentally, buy it now because you're beginning to make return off that investment now, rather than having money sitting in the bank earning 1 or 2%, where it could be on your roof earning 17 or 18%.
And I'm going to say, and you're decarbonising the grid as well.
Of
course, I'm going to say
decarbonising as well.
Exactly.
What's not to like?
Okay, I think Joel, it's you.
I actually just had a sort of speculative question, but so Alan, your business is next to a solar farm. Have you spoken to them? And I don't know if this is a thing which has been introduced anywhere, but is it possible to get sort of a direct line from solar farms so that you can get the renewable energy directly from them? It's renewable energy, and therefore you can you reduce your emissions without necessarily having to own the solar panels yourself.
Can I just jump in? Sorry, can I just jump in for a second? I think within the answer there, if we can consider something about private line within that, as well as your situation and what is appropriate to say about your situation there, Alan, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, we did actually talk to the people with the solar farm, but everything they generate is already allocated and sold, so they didn't have any to supply us anyway. But I suppose that must be a possibility, if you like. Because it was right next door, we did just sort of ask the question. But all our bought energy is from renewable source anyway. We even buy what's considered green gas, which it does tend to be a little bit more expensive, but we don't tend to use very much. So we can sort of absorb that small extra cost because we have low usage.
Yeah, and then just building on what Alan was saying, absolutely, it is possible to do this technically and commercially as well. And it's several ways of doing it. There is one way is called a direct wire. You can physically have a cable going from a nearby solar farm into your site, or indeed into an industrial site. And I'm beginning to see industrial sites now being built with solar farms close by, where there's a direct link into the submains within the site. But also there's something called power purchase agreements, where you can indirectly buy electricity from a renewable energy source through actually entering into a contract, either directly or indirectly, with the renewable energy generator to buy their electricity. Now, strictly speaking, you don't actually get their electricity, but you're getting electricity via the grid. So the way it would work, say for Alan's instance, for instance, the solar farm would sell the electricity to the grid. Then you'd have a PPA with the grid or directly with the solar farm, which allows you to buy that electricity straight from the solar farm. There's also something out going through Parliament at the moment called the Community Energy Bill, I think it's called, which will allow renewable generators, small-scale renewable generators, which could be anything up to a megawatt, to sell their electricity directly to electricity consumers. But at the moment, the way we've structured the electricity market, it's very difficult to do that. In fact, it's not only difficult, it's illegal. But that's the change. It needs a change in law more than anything else, and change in regulation. But the technology exists, and it's relatively straightforward to do.
I guess the benefit of being able to get a direct link is in location-based emissions rather than a power purchase agreement or renewable tariff, which sort of only lets you reduce your market-based emissions. If that makes sense, it's just different bit of the footprint.
just to elaborate there, for those of you measuring your carbon footprint, this is effectively behind the meter, so that you don't need to report those emissions associated with that. Great. Okay. As we move forward, I've got one. Alan has actually mentioned gases there. So the another question I've been asked here, and this may involve some crystal ball gazing, is when do we expect to see hydrogen readily available on the grid for us to use? So who would like to take that one?
I could have a first go. Well, not like the answer. I don't think you're going to see hydrogen on the grid to use in. That's not the way I personally think hydrogen will be used. To pipe hydrogen through the grid for, say, using in a domestic boiler or a gas boiler, I think is going to be very unlikely. The energy economics just don't work for that. It's an incredibly inefficient way to take renewable energy and return it into an energy store. But hydrogen will be, I think, it's a great storage medium, and it will be used, I think, personally, in a number of very bespoke circumstances, aviation being one of them. Manufacture of cement and steel will be another where hydrogen will be used, and as a grid storage medium. So when there is lots of spare capacity in the grid, particularly from wind, that can be turned into hydrogen, green hydrogen, by the way, not blue or grey hydrogen, through electrolysis in the main, and then it could be fed back. But actually pumping hydrogen to boilers is a very inefficient way of using renewable energy. It'd be far better to use that renewable energy to drive a heat pump. I wouldn't say it's order of magnitude better efficiency, but it's 5 or 6 times better efficiency than using hydrogen directly to be burnt in a boiler. So my response was, I wouldn't expect to see hydrogen in the grid, but that's a controversial view. Not everyone agrees with it, and I know there are some big trials going on at the moment in Leeds, for instance, where hydrogen and methane are being mixed in the grid. But the energy economics to me just don't stack up.
I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Certainly, a National Grid had an aspiration to make hydrogen a significantly available, and by that, I think they were meaning 25% of usage overall. So I mean, that doesn't obviously specify whether that is industrial and those specialists rather than going to our homes. 25% of gas by hydrogen by 2030, which I would love to see that.
I think,
as we stand here in 2023, they've got a lot of work to do.
And I think most of that is actually burning hydrogen in effectively heat engines in thermal power generation. So it's captured renewable energy, spare renewable energy, turned into hydrogen, and that hydrogen then burnt in a thermal power station. A gas turbine power station, effectively. Unfortunately, they don't work very efficiently, those gas turbine power stations.
Great.
But if you've got free energy, it's still very good. So my guess would be most of the hydrogen will be used to actually power grid generated electricity.
I think there's quite a few demands of hydrogen, which there's quite a lot of areas where hydrogen will be very useful, but it will require quite a lot of it. So I think any spare energy will end up getting used for those applications. So like you rightly said, aviation, if you look at the amount of hydrogen that could require, it's completely crazy. It's like thousands of tons every day to each airport or something.
We need to scale up big time. Come to the end of the session. Please do scan the QR code. That is the feedback form. Let us know what you'd like to hear from these sessions. If you'd love to speak, then we would really like to hear from you on that. Joel's just going to pop that link, the manual link for the feedback form on the screen there in the chat function for you. For those of you who want to check out Martin's last presentation in the first of these, please do go to the SBN videos page. I've popped that in the chat already. This is what the page looks like. It's sort of tiled a bit like Netflix, and you can choose any of our recent presentations. There's an excellent one there that we did on net zero that's worth checking out, and these are all completely free to view. So all that remains is me to say thank you so much to our speakers today, and to mention without the kind contributions from the three councils, these sessions couldn't take place, and the councils are Basingstoke and Deane, Rushmore and Hart. So thank you to the councils for supporting these.
We look forward to seeing you next time at the Sustainable Business Network, so please do keep liking, sharing and subscribing for all the latest on what we're doing.